Hey guys, sorry to interrupt the podcast real quick, but before we get started here, Rodrigo and Jaron are not able to join this one, and I may mention this in the intro actually, but nonetheless, Rodrigo did want to, give a little debrief over the last three games, kind of wrap up his thoughts and things of that nature. The topic of the podcast today is going to be what exactly is the direction of this Mavericks team, and I talk a lot and allude a lot to these last three games and the sort of different dynamics we've seen between how good the Mavericks played in that Heat game versus how bad they played in that fourth quarter of that Clippers game, and that abysmal defensive game versus the Wizards, and just like very much questioning overarchingly like how bad the defense is. And Rodrigo, he wasn't able to join for this podcast unfortunately, but he wanted to give a little brief summation of his thoughts over the last few games. So without further ado, here's going to be his thoughts, and then we're going to segue back to my intro, and then we're going to get go the ad break, and then we got the podcast for you guys. So let's get on to it.
So, as you guys probably now know, I am not a part of this episode tonight because of prior commitments, but hey, hopefully I'll be back for next podcast if everything can line up. But I did decide to send the boys this message just, so that they can actually have something on me, and, some of my comments, you guys can get some of my comments, the listeners can get my thoughts on this game. Is, again, the Mavericks fall 126 to 125. I guess the first thing that comes to mind, first off, sorry, Jaron, because you told me during the game that, you were undefeated every time you went to a Mavericks game, and you were able to, you guys told me the story about how you guys caught the Luka 60 piece. I'm so sorry. I mean, at least I got a chance to see a Luka 40 piece, but hey, that doesn't help out any in the end, because again, the Mavericks can't seal the deal, seems like. Unfortunately, on defense was really the biggest issue. There was one really, really big play at the start of the fourth quarter with Kyle Kuzma, who, again, I'll get into the Spencer Dinwiddie, Kyle Kuzma beef here in a second, where Spencer Dinwiddie went ahead and moved to the left, and Kyle Kuzma was just left wide open for a three. I guess Spencer thought that the kick was coming out to the really top part of the three-point line as opposed to the corner part of the three-point line. And again, Kuzma was found wide open and nailed a three-pointer at the start of the fourth quarter. It wasn't a crucial, when you look at it really microscopically speaking, it's not a very, very big deal. But then when you look at it in the magnitude or in the overall spectrum of the game, plays like that eventually end up hurting you in the long haul. And again, the Mavericks really could not do much or muster up anything on defense. Dwight Powell had his best game as a Maverick, darn near. I think he had a 26-point game sometime earlier, but the 22-point game, I think 9 rebounds as well. He almost had a double-double. So that was pretty good. Again, Luka dropping 41. I think it was 41, 15, and 3 or something like that. And then Spencer Dinwiddie, I think, had 20 himself. And one thing, too, that I do also want to touch up on, and hopefully the boys can look into or touch on their side of the podcast, is how this front office can't seem to take a shred of accountability. And I'll start with Mark Cuban, because the Fire Mark Cuban poster guy sign, or sign poster guy, whatever, however you want to call him, the poster guy, the Fire Mark Cuban poster guy, was at the game and had security take away his sign. Folks, we live in America. I mean, that's free speech. That's 100% free speech. He wasn't being nasty. He wasn't being rude. He's expressing his thoughts, and that his thought should be fire Mark Cuban. Rightfully so, because of the on-the-court product is so bad on defense. On offense, it's firing on all cylinders. As a matter of fact, it's firing more than it's ever have. Josh Green is back. He looked electric in one of the first games back. But the fact of the matter is that this front office cannot take any accountability for themselves or for the product that they put on the court. and the fans' reactions is 100% justified. On that same note, when you really, really look at it in the grand scheme of things, yeah, sure, Cuban has the right to, take that fan's poster away or blah, 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 because but again, how can you not expect a fan reaction like that when you're putting an on-the-court product that cannot hold a team under 126 points? Spencer Dinwiddie, despite what you may think about what he said to Kyle Kuzma and the Washington Wizards, that they're not playing winning basketball or that they're not aiming to win anything, that they're just showcasing, in spite of what you may think of those comments, he's right. The Mavericks should be playing defense better. It's plain and simple as that. A team should not allow 120 plus points and still lose. We saw that with the San Antonio Spurs. I mentioned it to Jaron during the game. The San Antonio Spurs scored 120 points a couple nights ago and let up 140. You are not the San Antonio Spurs. You are the Dallas Mavericks with Luka Doncic, a MVP caliber player, on your court, and you still can't muster up enough defensive plays to win a ball game. That is shameful. The fact of the matter is, again, in spite of what you may think about the poster guy, in spite of everything else, Spencer Dinwiddie is right on a lot of things he said, and the truth hurts. The truth hurts. If you can't handle it, walk out. Seriously. It's as plain and simple. It's as plain and simple as that. I'm being perfectly honest here. Other observations, I guess, that I made. Again, Luka's frustration again was very, very, very well noted. Is just that how can you not be frustrated when you have Tim Hardaway Jr. jacking up threes and only scoring 5 points out of all the threes that he was able to jack up. It's a complete mess. The Mavericks right now are a complete mess. And as far as the trade deadline is concerned, your four untouchables, in my eyes, are Spencer Dinwiddie, Christian Wood, Luka Doncic, 100% obviously. Let's see, I see Wood, Josh Green, Luka Doncic, and Spencer Dinwiddie, because he's one of the only ones that can really break down a game. And even if you do want to keep him as a sixth man or as a starter or whatever you want to do with Spencer Dinwiddie, at the end of the day, he has, I think, played good enough to keep himself a spot here. Everybody else, DP, again, he's just very streaky. Tim Hardaway, same thing. Reggie Bullock is finding his stride, but he didn't do that well last night that I'm aware of. I think he had maybe like 10 or 11 points that I can recall. Dorian Finney-Smith, all those guys, for the right price, I'd ship them off to whoever wants them, really. And I've seen rumors that it could be OG Anunoby. I've been, wanting OG Anunoby as a Maverick for the longest time. Again, we'll see as the trade deadline gets closer and closer. We will see what happens with this Dallas Mavericks team. I will hopefully be back, Friday? Yeah, Friday, after the Phoenix Suns to touch up on that game, and hopefully we can bounce back, because, this team is starting to go into free fall, and they're in 7th place right now in the Western Conference, and I think 2nd or 3rd place in the Southwest Division, so that is definitely not good. But I will see everybody on Friday, hopefully. And it's Rigo signing out.
I'm Big Don Luca, smoking like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it
to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm unfortunately not joined here today by my co-hosts, Rodrigo or Jaron, due to some pre-existing circumstances. But nonetheless, we are going to be getting into the Mavericks' last 3 games. It is a stretch that's kind of been very emblematic of the Mavericks season, very up and down, as the Mavericks have kind of teetered in that sort of above 500 area throughout this whole season. It's been a really weird stretch as of late that's kind of persisted amidst the Mavericks kind of trying to counteract some of these injuries that are happening to them as they approach the All-Star break. And I really think that these last 3 games to an extent are kind of a microcosm of the season in terms of the Mavericks really don't have a direction right now. They have not picked a direction. Some nights, like the game against the Heat a few nights ago, they look like a team that is of caliber, when they're hitting their shots and they're clicking and, they're able to be very switchable on defense. They look like a team that is able to beat, top 5 teams in the NBA on night in, night out basis. And then, this last game versus the Wizards and then this game versus the Clippers the other day where they had that fourth quarter collapse, they look like they could get run out the gym by anybody. So there's a lot of sort of compelling narratives to get into in regards to how the Mavericks are kind of just unable to really have any sort of consistency this season. We see them, it's just a very big up and down effect. The Mavericks last year were able to turn the page at this point in the season. They were on track and they started winning games, once we got to towards the end of January, they really started to get going, right? And this team just simply has not done that this year. So they're slightly over 500 right now as we, we're kind of approaching steadfast towards the All-Star break. Of course, we're going to be back with more post-game podcasts for you guys every night as we ride it out till the All-Star break, of course. But nonetheless, before we get into this podcast, here's an ad from our sponsor, Anchor. All right, guys. So getting into it here, Jaron actually sent me a stat today that actually took me aback a little bit. The Mavericks are 2-8 in their last 10 games. Now, reason being, obviously the Mavericks have definitely skidded this last little recent stretch. And I think as a fan base that, we definitely collectively knew that. But for them to be 2-8 in the last 10 games is definitely, took me aback. And it was definitely a little bit of a surprise to me. I earnestly did not think that they had slid to that degree amidst this recent stretch. And at this point in the season, they're 25-24, at one point being, I think, 6 or 7 games over 500. Now they're only 1 game above 500. So obviously the Mavericks, these last 3 games against the Clippers, Heat, and Wizards have all, had their ups and downs, but it's definitely emblematic of a larger little recent stretch, I think, right? And I kind of want to dissect this in terms of looking at the positives and negatives of this stretch for the Mavericks, right? Because they've dealt with some injuries and they're definitely not totally, the Mavericks aren't all to blame for all the struggles that have persisted over this little recent stretch. But I mean, to say the least, a lot of the things that they are doing definitely to a degree, I think at least, serve to have some sort of solutions or at least could be patched to some certain degree. So we're going to be getting into that here today. First off, though, I'd like to talk about the positives because I do feel as if there's a lot less of those than there are negatives, unfortunately, right? And I would rather save the bad energy for when I've been rolling a little harder on the podcast, once I really get churning and everything. But we'll warm up with some, beautiful, nice Mavericks talk here. So I think the first positive, especially amidst this recent stretch, continually, he seems to be the overarching positive. And he is a guy that, no matter what is happening regarding the team, he has the occasional off game. There are things that we can nitpick about his game, but of course, that is Luka Doncic, right? He has scored 34, 29, and 41 in his last 3 games. He is still a offensive powerhouse to whatever sort of degree you would want to label him. He is utilizing basically every single aspect of offensive basketball to an extent. He is operating in the post. He is probably the best player in the NBA right now, just in terms of manipulating the pick and roll and, playing you based on the pick and roll coverage that he gets countered with. He is totally on a different level. He's a complete 3-level scorer. I mean, I don't know his exact numbers in terms of his points accounted for, between his points and assists that he's having per game, but they have to be off the charts. At one point he was the highest usage rate in the league. I still think that that's true. He's having an MVP year, but if the Mavericks continue to slide, then he's not going to be in the conversation just due to record, of course. But he amidst this recent stretch, nothing has really took a fall off from Luka. He's still him, really, except his defense, which we'll all get into later. His defense has definitely not been on par with what it was earlier in the season, in my opinion. That's something that we can definitely microanalyze and nitpick as we, divulge later into the pod. But I do, I've still been wildly impressed with how he's played on offense. As I say, basically every podcast, that he doesn't have the occasional clunker or off game. Everybody's going to have those. It happens. Luka is no exception. But to say the least, he's still been playing very, very well. Next, another positive, Dorian and Josh Green in this stretch, of course, having come back from injury. I believe it was, that first game back after the Portland game where both of them came back. No, it was that Hawks game rather. It was that Hawks game right after the Portland road stretch. So they've now been back for 4 games. We're kind of obviously dialing in on these 3 games versus the Wizards, Clippers, and Heat more specifically. But nonetheless, they have definitely, I think, both been net positives, particularly Josh Green, who's, he doesn't look like he missed a beat out there. He's came back. He's served as an offensive valve in terms of being a guy that can attack off closeouts. He's still shooting corner threes really well. He's running the floor really well in transition. He occasionally still has the, his over-fouling tendencies, but I still think his defense has been really good, particularly his on-ball defense. Really switchable. He's been doing all the things that we wanted him to do. I mean, he's attacking very aggressively and assertively. Aggressively just in terms of the intensity that he comes off with on these drives, but assertively in terms of the way that he's able to control himself when getting to the rim. He had a spin move the other night versus the Wizards, where I thought that he was definitely going to go flying out of bounds or the ball was going to get tipped or, led astray somewhere, but he controlled it and made a layup. I mean, I'm not saying that Josh Green has entered the realm of third ball handler, but in terms of being a sort of pseudo offensive creator who has the ability to attack off a closeout, can run in transition, is a good cutter, can basically generate offense outside of just being a 3-and-D wing, a guy who's going to spot up in the corner. He's been doing that in these last 4 games, and he had 16 points, one of his best games against the Wizards last night. He's been playing great, and I love the way that he's able to push the pace for the Mavericks in transition, the way he's able to defend, and, anything that we're getting from him in terms of his offensive creation or, ability to attack off a closeout, things of that nature, that's a plus in itself. But he's played great. Dorian, right? He's come back from that injury too, that that hip abductor strain or whatever it was. He's been doing good as well. Okay. I mean, he's obviously, there's been a couple games where he has looked like he's definitely still been trying to get into the groove of things, particularly that Hawks game comes to mind where he definitely was getting blown by a lot more than I think we're typically used to Dorian getting blown by. But to say the least, he's still shot decent. He hasn't really played off the charts. It's not to like a Josh Green level that I was just alluding to, of course, where Dorian's coming in and just not missing a beat after injury. You can definitely see that there's a little bit of growing pains, that Dorian's still kind of missing a step at times. He just looks a little slower out there overall, but I mean, he's been doing a good job. I think particularly when the defense misses their rotations, he's been doing a good job attacking off closeouts. Definitely not in the same fashion of Josh Green. He doesn't have that ability to, once he attacks a close off and then somebody helps, he doesn't have the ability to dissect that next level of defense and then try to make a move at the rim, that Josh Green's been doing. And I mean, something I didn't even allude to with Josh Green was his passing. That's been something where, he hasn't been necessarily that valve in the 4-on-3 when Luka gets doubled, is that guy who's able to facilitate in the short roll that we saw at times before his injury. But he has been doing a really good job when the Mavericks catch the defense off guard, when guys are kind of, the rotations for the other team on defense sort of, get all mismatched and mangled up. Josh has been doing a good job of diagnosing, when to, swing it to the corner, swing it to the wing after attacking the middle of the floor. And that's been something that the Mavericks, sorely need. and he's been doing a really good job just as a guy who can, really be another passer outside of Luka, right? Josh may not be the guy who's going to necessarily play make and, get the ball to guys in spots in the pick and roll. But I mean, that doesn't mean that he's not a type of guy that can penetrate and kick or penetrate and catch a defense off guard and hit somebody, coming on a cut. I mean, there's just a lot of different ways that they've been using him. I mean, they used him on a V cut last night. The Mavericks did. And, where Dorian set a screen of him at the low block, and he was able to get the ball for a layup. I mean, he's just a really fun guy to watch. But nonetheless, back to Dorian, he's been shooting decent, right? The defense has been kind of spotty. It's like sometimes it's on, sometimes it's off. But he's just trying to get acclimated when coming back from injury. And I'm not necessarily blaming him for not a slow start, but definitely more kind of a mediocre stretch here for him. I think he's really going to start to not catch fire, but he's going to start getting back to his normal self here soon. So I'm not tripping about Dorian, and I think that he's definitely at least held his own amidst this little stretch. The defense has been inconsistent, but it hasn't been asinine. It hasn't been something that is completely detrimental to this team. The defense overall for this team, which we'll get into here in a second, has been detrimental for this team, undoubtedly. But Dorian in himself, I don't believe that he is necessarily, all to blame for a more bigger holistic problem, right? Next up, Dwight Powell. I think at least on offense, Dwight Powell has had a good little stretch here. He had, I believe, a season high with 22 last night against the Wizards. It was a game where Gafford definitely had his woes in terms of defending Dwight Powell. Gafford's definitely a great, weak side help, rim protector and things of that nature. But he does have his issues staying with centers man to man. That's why the Wizards have, not the Wizards specifically, but I know their fan base is kind of throwing him in trade talks, things of that nature, just in terms of fake trades and all that sort of stuff. But Powell did a really good job just doing what he always does, which is being a great rim runner and, just patiently spacing the floor and awaiting the ball in the dunker spot whenever it gets to him. There were a few times, particularly last night against the Wizards, where, Luka would get doubled and he would drag dribble outside about half court, and he was able to find Powell under the rim for some and ones. I mean, I think even it was either, Tim at one point found him under the rim for a layup, which was really surprising. They've been, Dwight Powell, he's been doing a better job sealing when he gets in those low post positions, adding, a little bit of his element and just another offensive element to his game, right? He's really picked up the slack, at least on offense, with Christian Wood out. Maybe not defensively, but Dwight Powell is holding his own, to say the least. There obviously are always going to be the defensive issues in terms of, the stark inability of him to flip his hips on defense and be able to guard out in space and when somebody's charging at him downhill. But on offense, I mean, he's been playing his role to an absolute T. And in a game where the opposing, big man is not able to counteract, him effectively. And, it's just particularly maybe not a good man-to-man defender. Powell can have a game where he scores 15, 20 points, right? Just, doing his job. And that's all you can ask for him. He's always a great hustle player. The rebound is up and down, but the rebounding is up and down rather. But I do like what I've seen from him on offense throughout the stretch. He's playing his role. He's serving as that release valve for Luka in the pick and rolls. They've ran a few Spain pick and rolls with him. He's been playing decent, right? And I don't want to take that away from him. He's obviously had his defensive woes, but I mean, that's something that we can expect. Just given the personnel of this team, I think we can expect that to a certain degree, maybe not as bad as they've played recently, but to a certain degree, we can expect these defensive woes just with the personnel of this team. So, that's really it for Dwight. Another guy who's kind of been doing decent lately. He's on the sort of outskirts or the fringe of the rotation per se. But Davis Bertans, I mean, he's been shooting a little better recently. He's been running the floor every once in a while. He'll attack off a closeout, maybe shoot a mid-range jump shot or something. He is one-dimensional, but at the same time, he's not totally one-dimensional. Every once in a while, he will do something that kind of surprise you. He's definitely sneaky athletic, which obviously I think gets sort of intertwined with, him not, it gets intertwined with the fact that he's bad at defense. So people, I think, automatically associate that with him being unathletic, but he does have, the ability to kind of get out in space and transition. Sometimes he runs down the floor hard. He's been doing a good job occasionally, once he's running off of a double, sort of he's running like off a double back screen from, two guys, and he's just running as hard as he can, basically wing to wing. He'll catch guys off guard sometimes when the closeout, comes at him so hard and he's able to get a layup or something. So he had a rougher start shooting the ball this year, but he's been starting to make a few threes here. He's been starting to get to the rim occasionally. So I've liked how he's played so far. He's obviously still a complete black hole liability, whatever, synonym you want to apply to him in terms of how bad he is on defense, but he's been playing decent offensively well. Another positive that we can get into is I think Spencer Dinwiddie. He's caught a lot of fire from Mavs fans recently. We're going to get into his comments here when we get to the negative section. He had some interesting post-game comments after the Wizards game the other day. And his defense has been very, very it's just like very, spotty is the word that I apply to a lot of these Mavericks guys. And I don't think that it would be any less applicable to Spencer. He, his defense kind of comes in spurts and goes. He had a stretch this season where he was actually serving as a really he was a really good off-ball defender. He was able to pick passing lanes consistently. Now that's probably the part of his game that he's more liable. I honestly think that he's done a little bit better defending on ball as the season's kind of treaded along, but he has a tendency to kind of get lost in rotations, not close out hard enough, get caught ball watching, things of that nature as of recent. And that's kind of been detrimental to the Mavericks at the defensive end, something we'll get into here. But he's averaged 20 points and 5 assists per game over the last 3 games. He's, the shooting's been kind of average. Like last night, he had a 6 for 15 line, but he's been shooting the ball from 3 really well. I still think he's above 40% last time I checked. He's definitely being a little more assertive after, that stretch where, at the end of December where Luka was kind of just going pure God mode, was, basically heliocentrism down to a T, where Luka was, spearheading the offense at the point of attack almost every possession down the floor, right? Spencer has definitely alleviated some of the stress from him, admittedly, right? Luka's still obviously the primary ball handler, playmaker, of course, for the Mavericks, but Spencer has done a great job, especially he's kind of like last 3-5 games about being assertive, particularly in those non-Luka minutes. He's doing a great job attacking. I always kind of love his ability to bounce to the side of the non-screen side. If he gets a screen every once in a while, he'll kind of throw the defense a loop and go to the weak side and kind of catch him off guard and throw it up. He does some sort of ticky-tacky things to get fouls, of course, but I think he's been doing a better job getting to the rim in those minutes when he's playing with Luka. Every once in a while, he'll bring the ball up, or he'll come off a back or a down screen and get the ball at the wing and shoot a 3, or, try to get to the rim in a pick and roll. Like, he's been doing some different things, right? And this is the Spencer I like to see. And, if the Mavericks were able to ever at any point accumulate somebody that would relegate him to the bench, I still think that's the most idealistic scenario where he's that 6-man ball handler. But nonetheless, he's playing well offensively recently. He's still definitely a part of the guys that I'm going to nitpick when I get into the defensive woes and sides of things over there, right? But he's been playing well offensively. And I think lastly, for the positives, I think that we have to recognize Reggie Bullock. He's still definitely having some man-to-man defensive issues, but he's shooting 35.3% from 3 on the season. And, at first glance, that may not look too impressive, especially for a guy that's career like 38 to 40% 3-point shooter. But we do have to consider that he was below 30% for a large stretch of the season at the start. And he's got it up. He's been shooting really well recently. He's been doing good in his pick and pops with Luka. Anytime that, Luka's doubled, and it, creates that domino effect where the Mavericks start passing the ball around the perimeter, and he's able to, to be the recipient of that last pass. He's been knocking it in more times than not, and he's been doing a good job shooting. We've even seen Reggie kind of attack off a closeout and shoot some jump shots a couple times in the mid-range area. Not something that's been prominent, and, he'll still miss some wide open layups that you're just like, oh, I would definitely not like this guy on my team, type sort of things. But at the end of the day, he has been shooting the ball well from 3, and he's serving his purpose, at least on the offensive end from that perspective, right? So, cumulatively, I really couldn't come up with more positives than that. About 5 positives there, and I was kind of stretching it with those last 2 with like Davis and Spencer 3-point shooting. But we have to analyze this stretch in its entirety. We can't take something, everything away from the Mavericks, but there obviously are more bad things than good that have happened throughout these last few games. That's undoubtable. I would definitely say that, right? And it starts at defense, and whether the Mavericks are playing zone, whether they're playing man to man, whether they're playing matchup zone, whether it's a game where they're more switch heavy, the defense has just lacked effort and consistency. And the reason I say effort, and it boils down to that, the Mavericks have now succumbed to being 26th in the NBA in defensive rating. Now, let me preface that defensive rating stats and defensive stats in general, you have to kind of take with a grain of salt, because though when you start getting into some of those advanced splits and the way defensive stats are sort of tailor-made, it is kind of weird when you look at the intricacies of how they make these defensive stats and the certain qualifiers that some of these stats entail for, basically like how they're calculated, things of that nature. And because, defense is very much, you do have to have some sort of eye test to know what you're talking about. It's not as, oh, I'm just going to go to Second Spectrum or Basketball Reference and, I can diagnose who the best players in the league are via VORP. I get that. We're talking about MVP and things of that nature. Like there's different stats that are more applicable in terms of diagnosing who's a better player or who's better on offense. Defensive rating stats, they're up and down like that, right? But nonetheless, that doesn't take away from just how bad, that stat is after the Mavericks at one point in the season, throughout the first, I think 15, 20 games were top 10 in defensive rating. I mean, that has to mean something. They're now 26 in defensive rating, and seemingly they just look kind of lackadaisical at times. In the Miami game, right? The Mavericks, there was the first game where Christian Wood had missed, or was it the Hawks game? Let me check to see if Christian Wood played in the Hawks game. My brain is leaving me right here. I do apologize, my fellow mainstream Mavs comrades. Okay. Yes. So Christian Wood did play in the Hawks game. That was my mistake. That was the game, of course, where he had the thumb injury, where he dunked it too hard in the fourth quarter. It was a weird sort of contusion, but he's going to be out a week or two, and the Mavericks we're going to get into that in a second as one of the negatives, but the Mavericks are obviously having to survive in this stretch without him. And needless to say, through 3 games, they're 1-2. So, I mean, take that how you will, right? But defensively, I think there were a lot of narratives on Mavericks Twitter going around that, oh, are the Mavericks better defensively? Because the Mavericks, I mean, admittedly, one of the few games throughout this whole stretch that they did play really well was that Heat game last Friday night, where the Mavericks beat the Heat. I believe it was 115-98, unless my brain is completely leaving me. And Christian Wood did not play in that game, and the Mavericks were forced to go smaller at times. Dwight Powell definitely wasn't showcased as much as he has been in both this Clippers and Wizards game, near as much in that game. The Mavericks deferred to playing smaller a lot, and by virtue of that, that made them a lot more switchable. And the defensive intensity just seemed to be able to pick up a little bit more. I thought the Mavericks point of attack defenders and Josh and Reggie, I mean, even Reggie in that game, that, he's had his ups and downs, but in that game, I thought he played decent. And Dorian, like, they all did a really good job, like, just man to man on Hero, Butler and Lowry. They were keeping guys in front of them. They weren't over fouling. The intensity, it was a national TV game, if I recall. The intensity just looked better. It looks like it's almost as if the Mavericks got up for it. I do think the Mavericks don't have the perfect defensive roster by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, there's, a lot of solvents that they can definitely apply in terms of roster management, maybe over the next year or two, or maybe they can't, given their, how hard pressed they are to make significant upgrades to the team. But we do have to recognize that they played very well on that Heat game, and it was in no small part due to the fact of the switchability and the ability to go small. Now, I will say that the Heat, they do have Bam Adebayo, who's a very dynamic center, but he's only like 6'9". They don't have some sort of persistent, especially in the way that they're using Bam this year. They're using him more that elbow area. They're running a lot of offense through him. He's definitely not a guy at this stage in his career who's getting as many, pick and rolls where he's running straight to the rim, trying to catch a lot pass. I'm not saying that that's totally just devoid from his game, but that's not something we're seeing as much from him at this juncture in his career. And I think that was definitely a contributor in terms of how the Mavericks defense was able to work in that game, because just the fact that there wasn't a threat at the rim consistently, especially in those non-Bam minutes, the Heat were forced to play small too. And the Mavericks, they were reliant on their perimeter defense in that game. And sure, I mean, some negative shooting regression from the Heat. They kind of got a little lucky with some of that sort of stuff. But I mean, overall, like, they did a really good job forcing the issue at the point of attack. And, there definitely just seemed like an increased sense of urgency. I mean, I don't know what exactly changes in, the rest of this stretch where the Mavericks have went 2-8. But I mean, that Heat game did look pretty good, right? Defensively, there's no negating that. The Mavericks defenders just serve to be a lot more switchable. And I mean, I can go back to the box score here just to see how many minutes Dwight Powell played in that game, but it was 115-90. So my apologies. Mavericks actually held the Heat to a lot less than I configured at first. And I mean, nobody on the Heat scored above 20 points. Oladipo did, but on wildly efficient shooting, of course, but he only had exactly 20. And I mean, Dwight Powell, I mean, he played 33 minutes in that game, but Josh Green and Reggie both played 28 and 27 off the bench. And, when I said Dwight Powell wasn't showcased as much, I mean, I don't know. I just felt like they were doing a better job of hiding him on those wings and those guards on the Heat. They played Dorian a lot more on Bam. I noticed in that game, he got those 5 assignments, and the Heat just didn't really have the size to be able to counteract what the Mavericks were doing defensively. And that was one of the few games this season where the Mavericks like held an opponent under 100 points. We really haven't even seen that much. And I mean, it was impressive from that standpoint. And it was actually like fun to watch, but the last 2 games, there's definitely been a stark difference just in terms of the Mavericks of how they've operated defensively. And it's definitely been more, it's a microcosm and more emblematic of this bigger 10-game stretch where the Mavericks went 2-8 in their last 10, just in terms of how they played defense, right? Because the Mavericks do mix in zone. They do, mix in some matchup zone, and, some games are more switch heavy than not, depending on the opponent, right? All those different elements, we saw them incorporate in the Heat game as well. So that kind of tells me that it's probably not really schematic, right? The Mavericks issues are more so boiling down to personnel and effort, right? I mean, effort is, contingent in some of these games. I think we saw more applied effort in this Heat game, but also it was probably a matchup that boded well for the Mavericks because boded. Oh my gosh, my mistake, guys. It's sort of botched there. But I think that matchup just boded well more so for the Mavericks because the Heat, particularly, when Bam's out, they're playing a lot of like 5 out and things of that nature. They have a tendency to go smaller. That helped the Mavericks in stretches defensively in that game. But when we see the Clippers where they have, Zubac playing, or the Wizards where, they have the ability to throw Gafford out there, things of that nature. Those guys in themselves are not what's directly impacting the game defensively. But at that point, once you start to involve Dwight Powell in pick and roll scenarios, basically, for lack of a better term, everything goes to shit for the Mavericks. At that point, we do see a lot of failed pick and roll coverage from the Mavericks. Dwight Powell trying to play sort of that in between the screen game where he can't decide if he should hedge or if he should play back. And, when he does switch on to somebody on those brief occasions in a pick and roll, he gets beat quickly by a guard. Or, if the point of attack defender in front of Dwight gets beat and you're asking Dwight to be your weak side help protector, I mean, that's a task in itself, just basically good luck. So, I mean, that the point of attack is essentially where the Mavericks are losing because they're getting beat on the perimeter, and then they're heavily reliance on Powell as the only big amidst all these, amidst Christian Wood and Maxey being injured. That's a tall task for a guy who has been an average, at best defender throughout his NBA career too. And I think that's a big part of it. Like I said, just personnel, and the Mavericks don't have a lot of guys right now. If we obviously want to segue into how the Mavericks point of attack defense is, how the perimeter defense has been doing. I mean, outside of, Josh Green when he's in there and the occasional, flashback Dorian, defensive possessions, he's still, like I said, he's still kind of trying to get his step back. Reggie has been particularly lackluster on ball. I think Reggie's still been doing a decent job in terms of trying to, stick with guys. He's not a guy who gets caught up ball watching or misses rotations, but he's been getting blown by a lot, and there's no negating that, and that's hurting the Mavericks a lot. And Spencer, and the guys that we really don't look to as defenders near as much, like Spencer Dinwiddie, of course, Luka Doncic, and on top of that, we have Tim Hardaway Jr. I was trying to figure out his name, right? I don't know how I missed that, but those three guys, those are guys that are huge offensive contributors for the Mavericks, and they have definitely failed supremely and just over this last little stretch defensively, from the standpoint that, I really think all three of them, I think Tim, out of all three of them, has actually been the best defensively, which his track record would say otherwise, but he's been actually doing a decent job when he's lined up man to man on somebody. But all three of those guys have had really, really bad issues in terms of their ball watching, getting lost and caught up on rotations, missing coverages, sometimes occasionally not even, making the right switch. Luka, I thought, Luka's always good kind of about making the right switch just because of his, his basketball IQ is off the charts, but even he's getting blown by so much. The effort just isn't there consistently. He honestly looks like very, like he looks tired on that end, and he's just conserving energy for the offensive end. To an extent, that's a bigger discussion to be had, but can you blame him when he's playing 35 to 40 minutes a game? I don't know. And it has led the Mavericks, when you don't have a rim protector, Christian Wood's like a pseudo rim protector. He's a decent one, right? But that's not even his optimal role in terms of being a defensive player on the Mavericks, right? And then you surround him with basically four non-defenders except for Dorian, who, basically depending on the possession, whether, ever since he's got his mojo back, that kind of, or as he's getting his mojo back, rather, that kind of is contingent upon whether he's going to have a good defensive possession to get blown by or not. We've seen the Mavericks defense suffer heavily. And it just comes down to personnel at the end of the day. And with all these injuries to Maxey and everybody, they just don't have what it takes. There are solutions that the Mavericks could maybe dive into, maybe play a little more Frank Ntilikina. He was getting some run before this little stretch happened. He was actually playing quite well defensively. He does have his failures and his inconsistencies on offense. But even on that end, he definitely picked up the slack to an extent. Is he that release valve the Mavericks could look to instead of playing, Davis a little bit more? I don't know. I do think that the defensive issues on this team are so dire that they need to start looking at some different things. Maybe play, maybe insert Josh Green, the starting lineup, over like Tim Hardaway Jr. Like that would be a drastic change, but, or even Spencer. But is the Mavericks defense so riddled with, this non-effort and, this sort of loathsome, tiredness from Spencer, Luka, and Tim at the point of attack? These guys who are not able to, always, be there on rotations, are, getting kind of lackluster at times. I make it seem like they just don't do anything, but I do want to, at least give them some sort of credit where it's due, because obviously, like, I couldn't go out into an NBA court and run around for 48 minutes and play solid defense. Like I do get it's tiresome, but these guys are getting paid to do this. They're getting paid to ascend to that next level and put in the extra effort, even if that's not necessarily what their game is known for. And I get the exception in Luka's case because, the usage rate, how much of an offensive burden he carries. But especially for Dinwiddie and Tim, the ball watching and things of that nature, particularly when closing out on guys, is starting to get inexcusable. And the Mavericks are getting beat at the point of attack. And then, when Dwight Powell when you're basically segueing everybody to Dwight Powell in the paint, good luck. Like Kyle Kuzma had a play last night where he absorbed like all of Dwight Powell's body contact and like easily finished over him. And when the Mavericks do choose to go small throughout this stretch, they've been having some times where they played Bertans as a 5, they played Dorian as a 5. They just simply haven't had the perimeter defense, barring that Miami game, to back it up. They're getting beat consistently. And, they've had a tendency to play some zone sometimes when they go small, things of that nature. But to the level of which the Mavericks are conceding these 3-pointers, I mean, they're not just, it's not kind of like your typical, oh, the Mavericks are playing a 2-3 zone and they gotta, the Heat gotta open three. Oh no, right? I'm just giving an example, right? It's been like, no, like the other team is wide open with no guy within 8 feet of him and no guy not even attempting to even put a hand up at the last second. Like they could just care less. Like that is an issue in itself, and that's something that definitely is going to need to get patched, right? Because I mean, I don't know where these woes are coming from, because I mean the Mavericks defense sure was bad before this, but at this point it's really starting to get to a level where, I mean, it's like inexcusable effort, right? And obviously that's not something that I necessarily saw coming, but when you get past that midseason marker, things can start to eat up to you. And I mean, I think that's kind of where the problems lie. So we'll see where they go with things, but that's definitely been the biggest negative. I think undoubtedly that's been the biggest negative. And I mean, yeah, that kind of shows that it's like counterintuitive whether Christian Wood is part of the defense or not, or how he relates to this defense. Because I mean, yes, they did have that one good game with the Heat when they played small, but I do earnestly think that the problems stem deeper than that, because we've seen these last 2 games with the Clippers and the Wizards where, I mean, they've gone small and there's still been effort and rotational issues. So I mean, I guess that's my answer in summation, kind of to the Christian Wood question posed by a lot of fans on Twitter, whether they'd be a better defense with or without him. I mean, I guess only time will tell to an extent. But I guess if I had to pick a side right now, I'd probably go with the former there, and I would probably say that, hey, like this team's defensive issues definitely stem deeper than him, right? Another inconsistency that's kind of been happening as of recently, it's kind of just Tim Hardaway Jr.'s inconsistency. He was on a nice little hot stretch there for about 5-10 games. Last kind of 5-10 games, I mean, he's had some, nice haymakers where he scored over 20, shot well. Like that Clippers game, he played really well, but then that Heat game, he only had 8. The other night, he only had 5 on 1 for 10 shooting. I know Tim Hardaway Jr. is sort of the trademark of his game is, the ability, he's a very streaky player, the ability to kind of pop off whenever, but also shoot really bad sometimes. But you'd still like him to be at least give you like something more so than like just 1 for 10 and bad defense. I mean, hopefully he can figure that out a little bit, but he hasn't been playing terribly this season. Of course, he's had his moments, so I'm not going to rip him too hard. The other night versus the Wizards, Luka ripped his jersey in frustration after missing a free throw that would potentially tie the game with, I think, about like 20 or 30 seconds left. I'm just kind of trying to pick up on trends recently, whether it be on court or kind of more so the sort of antics that persist with these guys day to day as we monitor the team. And I mean, Luka, I mean, I'm not going to say that that's like emblematic of Luka, oh, he was just compiling all his frustration from the whole season into one jersey ripping. But I mean, I take it with definitely a grain of salt, but I mean, I think it means a little something, like, that you have to be pretty frustrated for something like that to happen. Things, not just in that game had to have been going bad, but just overall. But he is a competitor, and we've seen him do that in the past. It's just been a minute since he's done it. So I did pick up on that, and I did want to take note of that, but it definitely wasn't something that I'm like putting a lot of stock to or a lot of credence into. Something else that I think is an interesting narrative to kind of monitor going forward is Jason Kidd. Not, whether he has job security or not. I mean, we know that the front office is granting him that, but I mean, I think that recently he's kind of been a little enigmatic in terms of how he's operated with the rotations, right? We haven't seen Hardy play these last 2 games for whatever reason. He played a little bit in that Heat game, didn't really do the best just in like a few minutes of play, and was seemingly pulled right after. I talked a little bit about maybe they should play Frank a little more. Is there anything Jason Kidd can do to fix the defense, or is this all on the players? Is this all on the personnel? The guy's just not being fired up or energetic enough? I mean, I don't know. Like, could there be some stock into part of it being Jason Kidd? Yeah, I mean, there could be. Could his defense be getting figured out? Because his switches and his zones. This defense that he had worked so good in Milwaukee that one year was like a top 10 defense when he was over there. Then they fell off the next year. Could the same thing be happening in Dallas? Is it partly his fault? I don't know. I do think that we might have to put a little bit of stock into it, though. Um, I would like to see Jaden Hardy play a little more too, as I just alluded to. Like, I do think the Mavericks could sorely use a little more, pop off the bench. Just, Jaden Hardy, even if, you're not relying on him for that playmaking aspect of it. I mean, he can provide a little bit of defense. I mean, probably better man-to-man defense than a lot of guys that are starting and, or in those lead roles coming out the bench for the Mavericks. And I mean, that's at least what we've seen from him this year. I mean, yes, we had the defensive liability questions coming into him from the draft, right? But I mean, he showed that he's at least capable, right? So I don't know. There's credence to the fact that he could play a little more. So I mean, that definitely comes across as some sort of enigmatic decisions from Jason Kidd. Obviously there's the typical cliche Jason Kidd should, be more fired up and try to get bring some more passion to the game, stand up for his players more. I mean, to his credit, like he did get a tech last night, so I was gonna make that part of the podcast, but since he got a tech last night, we're gonna cut him some slack. Otherwise, this is just a singular play, and I'm not going to, just empty everything in the tank in terms of how much it actually matters. But the last play versus the Wizards the other night was I don't know. It was contingent upon a team that did not have a contingency plan, to say the least. There was about 5 seconds left, and the Mavericks were down one after Kuzma went 1-for-1 at the line, and the Mavericks inbounded the ball to Luka after he came off of a down screen. And the whole concept is they knew the Wizards were going to double, so they're trying to get Tim Hardaway Jr., the inbounder, the ball off a give and go, but it was just very tightly compact, and it didn't even look like a good play that would work at first. It would kind of involve a perfect pass. There was no sort of weak side rotation from the Mavericks offensive players to try to get an open, and the play failed the first time, and it goes off somebody's leg. But then the Mavericks still have 3.8 seconds left to try and do something. They run the same play again. Now, in an out of timeout scenario like that, I know that, it's loud in the arena. They've already, you've ran the play. You kind of just have to roll with it. But I don't know if it comes down to personnel and the players on the floor, or if it comes down to Kidd at least having like one sort of contingency or just another option off that play if the first, option isn't there with the give and go. I don't, necessarily know who to blame on that. But there's got to be something where, you just don't run the same play twice in a row in a scenario like that. Given the fact that, the Mavericks did not have a timeout, I do give them the benefit of the doubt from that standpoint. They didn't have time to go back to the huddle and draw something up. But, that whole like little weird give and go thing that ended up getting picked off by DeLon Wright on the second time they ran in a row. It was just a really weird, bittersweet way to end, definitely a bad game against a Wizards team like that. Just in terms of how abysmal the defense was at times. But, we also do have to recognize that it was a clutch game, and it was one the Mavericks could have finagled and stole, but I don't know. It was definitely a questionable decision, to say the least. And obviously I've harped on the defense ad nauseum and some of these other, sort of negatives that the Mavericks have had over this last little recent stretch. But, one thing that I think does kind of sum up how everything's been going recently is Spencer Dinwiddie's recent quotes. We obviously know Spencer Dinwiddie has some bad blood with the Wizards and what have you, and he's not the most keen to those guys over there. But some of his recent quotes are, a little bit. I don't know how much stock I put into them in terms of how much they mattered for the Mavericks team, but it is a little alarming to an extent. I think some of it is Wizards bashing, and some of it is kind of like, we got to be better, guys. It's an indictment upon the Mavericks to an extent. So I'll go ahead and read them for you guys real quick, right? Spencer Dinwiddie on the Mavs lost to the Wizards. This was reported by Kelly Kaplan. This is the first quote. There's two quotes I'm going to tell you guys. And the first one, I'm going to quote this word for word. Spencer Dinwiddie said, "For them, it's a showcase. They're over there trying to get paid, not trying to play winning basketball. For a team that has real aspirations and has an MVP, went to the conference finals last year, we have to be better to a man." And, for Spencer to say that, like, yes, like, it is knocking the Wizards to an extent, like, saying they're not trying to play winning basketball, even though they do have their record from the Mavericks is not too dissimilar. But at the same time, he is throwing shade at his guys. Like, we got to step up to the plate. Like, we've been playing terrible defense lately, like, things of that nature. And, and anytime quotes like that emanate, out of the locker room. It's typically not good. That's typically not what you'd rather see, but they do tend to slip through the cracks sometimes when things really start to go bad. I mean, yes, like I guess the Mavericks just kind of offsetting things by winning a game, and they're not on like a 10-game losing streak, but to be 2-8 in the last 10 games and to be down to that 6 seed and seemingly in that play-in territory again, that 500 territory, especially as compact as the West is right now, really just like 2-3 games between like 5 and 13. Like, I mean, Mavericks could be out of the playoff race if they just lose a couple games from here. It is getting to that point, guys. Like I've been on the train. Like a lot of people are kind of like, once we get that 4th or 5th seed, they're like, oh yeah, we're a lock to be at the play-in. Like the West is just too compact for me to say that. We'll have to see what happens, but like let's not act like the playoffs are just some sort of surefire thing to happen for this Mavericks team. Like, no, there really aren't fail safes. Like something bad really could happen. So we'll end up having to see how that ends up going down. But let me go ahead and read Dinwiddie's next quote. This was reported by Tim McMahon after the loss to the Wizards last night, of course. And I'll quote Dinwiddie word for word once again. He said, "You come in here and get in a shootout with the Warriors last year, the Celtics this year, or something like that. It's a little bit different tone, right? Not exactly stalwarts over there. So, it's more kind of sort of cliche stuff, him trying to throw shade at the Wizards. This one a little less. This one I think had a little less stock into it, just in terms of how much media coverage it picked up. But we do have to recognize that it's also not good in terms of the perception league wide when you're throwing shade over at those guys and they just beat you. Talking trash is typically reserved for the guys that win. And I don't know. It's like he is indicting the Mavericks and asking them to step up to the plate, but. I mean, I know he came from a weird situation in Washington, so I'm not going to knock him too much because there was another Mavericks, guy saying this. So it would be definitely raise some more alarm bells. But you definitely don't want to burn bridges and say things like that, because Kyle Kuzma quote tweeted the Spencer quote after the game and was like, we're really not all that. I can't remember exactly what he said. Let me pull up the Kuzma tweet because it was kind of sad. Let's see. So yeah, Kyle Kuzma quote tweeted the Cali Kaplan tweet and said, "The funny thing is they don't play winning basketball." And I mean that just makes us look like fools because we have a very similar, record to the Wizards. The whole heliocentrism weird narrative that goes around the national media that shouldn't be a thing because Luka obviously transcends winning for this team, and without him they'd be basically nothing, but nobody in the national media can fail to realize that. So it just furthers like stupid national media narratives when Spencer says something like that, and you just don't want to see it, especially at a time like this. Like I'd rather him trade a little more carefully, talk a little bit more about what the Mavericks could do better, but obviously there's some bad blood there with the Wizards, and what's said is done. So let's see if the Mavericks can kind of back up what they're doing here, and I hope it's what Spencer said, the Mavericks start to fix some of these things. Some of these things start to come into fruition, but things admittedly are looking like kind of bleak, especially in this little stretch here. The Mavericks do play these Suns tomorrow night, Thursday night, or I guess for those of you listening, tonight, Thursday night at 9:00 in Phoenix. Phoenix starting to get some of their guys back. Cam Johnson's back, Chris Paul's back. I don't know if Booker's back yet, but that'll be a tough game, especially with the injuries that are kind of running their course through the Mavericks right now with, of course, with Maxey still out and with Christian Wood still out. It's not going to be easy, but we'll see how they'll counteract it. This stretch is really interesting right now. And, it's January 25th or January 26th rather. And I still don't feel as if this team has an identity, which is a little bit concerning to say the least, because that's been the narrative going forward all year is like, what is the Mavericks identity? And, that's the topic of this podcast. Like, are they winning or are they losing? Like what direction are they picking? Are they just going through a rough stretch? I know the league is a game of runs, and that's even more so emblematic to games or stretches of games, not just like in one particular game, but this is a tough stretch right here. This is definitely one of the lower points this season, being 2-8 right now, and that around that 500 marker. They're either going to go up or down right here. I mean, this is the stretch that's going to make or break the season. That's why I denoted the title of this podcast, what direction is this Mavericks team going to pick? But yeah, to say the least, we'll be back for you guys after the Suns game tomorrow night. It's a real sort of weird situation the Mavericks are in, but hopefully they pull through and they at least pick a direction. That's all I ask. If they can just pick a direction. We had a lot of trade deadline stuff coming up. Who knows if the Mavericks will make a move, but we'll be hopping on the ball. There's been a lot of reports here the last few days that there's an increased sense of urgency for the Mavericks to do something. So really interesting to see how that goes. We're going to have a full trade deadline debrief over the next few days. We're going to be in some nice trade deadline podcasts out. So we're really excited for you guys. We are going to have Rodrigo and Jaren back for the next one, or Jaren's going to be back for the next one. And then after that, we should have all three of us back. So we're going to be cranking out that trade deadline podcast here soon. But besides that, we'll catch you guys after tomorrow night's game versus the Suns. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at mainstream_Mavs. Make sure to like and subscribe if you're on the YouTube game. Comment down below. How do you think the Mavericks versus Suns game is going to go tonight if you are listening via YouTube? If you guys are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any other podcast platform out there, make sure to subscribe and follow us and give us a 5-star rating if you so please. If you really enjoy our content, we do appreciate you guys who have listened this far in the podcast. And with that being said, we will catch you in the next one. Peace out.